Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a sickly green glow over the rain-slick pavement. Evergreen Motel. The name didn't fit. There was nothing fresh or alive about the place. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few rusted-out cars that looked like they'd been there for decades. Jared had been driving for nearly 10 hours, and exhaustion pressed down on him like a weight. He just needed a place to rest before finishing the last leg of his trip. The motel office smelled like stale cigarettes and something faintly sour. The man behind the counter barely looked up as Jared entered. His skin was waxy, eyes sunken, his nails long and yellowing as they tapped against the desk. "One night?" Jared said, sliding his credit card across the counter. The man's lips curled slightly, though it never reached his eyes. "Room 106, end of the hall." His voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in a while. Jared took the key, an actual metal key, not a card, and turned toward the hallway. The corridor was dimly lit, and the air smelled damp, like old carpet that had soaked up years of misery. He reached his room, noticing deep scratches along the doorframe, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. The moment he stepped inside, something felt off. The air was heavy, thick with something unidentifiable. The walls were a faded beige, stained with shapes that looked almost like faces. The bedspread was patterned with little blue flowers, but a closer look revealed dark stains beneath the fabric. He didn't want to think about what they were. He locked the door, securing the chain latch. The bathroom mirror was scratched, the sink dripped steadily, and the overhead light flickered every few minutes. Just one night, he reminded himself. Just a few hours of sleep. Jared collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, but sleep didn't come easy. The air conditioner rattled in the window, its groans almost masking the sound of something. Shuffling. He sat up, heart pounding. The noise wasn't from outside, it was inside the room, a slow, dragging sound. He reached for his phone, using the dim glow of the screen to scan the room. Nothing. But the sound persisted, like something shifting beneath the bed. Jared's breath hitched. He swung his legs off the mattress and crouched down, slowly lifting the bedspread. Darkness. And then, a pair of pale, glassy eyes stared back at him. He scrambled backward, slamming into the nightstand. The thing under the bed let out a low, rattling breath. Its mouth gaped open, lips shriveled and black, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. The smell of rotting meat filled the room. Jared lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock. Behind him, the thing started to move, long, bony fingers dragging across the floor. He yanked the door open and sprinted down the hall, not daring to look back. The front desk was empty. The man who had checked him in was gone. Not just gone. His chair sat in a thick pool of something dark, congealed. A rotten smell filled the air. Jared's hands shook as he pounded on the motel door, desperate to escape. The second he stepped outside, the neon sign overhead flickered out, leaving him in complete darkness. The door slammed shut behind him. When he turned, the Evergreen Motel was gone. Nothing but an empty lot, a stretch of cracked pavement and overgrown weeds. The road behind him stretched into the black void of the night. And somewhere just beyond the edge of the darkness, something breathed.
Story number 2.
It was a dark, rainy night when Sarah and her boyfriend, Mark, found themselves driving through the desolate countryside. They had been on the road for hours, and exhaustion was beginning to settle in. The GPS on their phone was barely working due to the lack of signal, and their headlights barely cut through the thick fog surrounding them. Just as they started to get anxious about finding a place to stay, a sign appeared in the distance. Whispering Pines Motel, vacancy. Relieved, they pulled into the gravel parking lot of the eerie, run-down motel. It looked like it hadn't seen a guest in years. The motel sign flickered weakly in the mist, casting a pale, ghostly glow across the building. There was something unsettling about the place. They were too tired to care. The only thing they wanted was a bed for the night. Inside, the motel lobby was dimly lit, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarettes. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes, greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her lips. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper as she handed over the key to room 13. "Just down the hall." "It's the last room," she murmured. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance but said nothing. They took the key and walked down the creaky hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The walls were yellowed, peeling in places, and the floorboards groaned under their weight. The air felt thick, as if something was pressing down on them, but they shrugged it off. They reached room 13. Mark inserted the key, and the door creaked open with an unsettling sound. The room was small, furnished with a single bed, an old television, and a small wooden dresser. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking any glimpse of the outside world. But what caught Sarah's attention was the mirror on the wall. It was cracked down the middle, the reflection of the room slightly distorted. They set their bags down, and as Sarah began unpacking, she noticed something strange. On the dresser there was a small piece of paper. It was folded neatly, as if someone had left it there for them. Curiosity getting the best of her, she unfolded it. "Leave before midnight. Trust me." Her heart skipped a beat. She showed it to Mark, but he just laughed it off. "Probably just a prank. Don't worry about it." But as the night wore on, a growing sense of unease crept in. The wind outside howled, and the rain beat against the windows with increasing intensity. At around 11:30 p.m., Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside their door. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. She felt a chill run down her spine as the doorknob rattled. Mark stood up, confused and alarmed. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no answer. The rattling stopped, but something felt off. They both froze. Then the silence was shattered by a loud bang against the door. Sarah jumped, her heart racing. Mark quickly went to the door, but just as he touched the handle, a low voice, barely a whisper, came from the other side. "Leave. Now." The voice was so cold, so threatening that Mark's hand trembled as he backed away. The door shook again, harder this time, as if someone was pounding on it from the outside. But when they peeked through the peephole, there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Panic set in. Mark grabbed Sarah's hand and they rushed to gather their things. But as they reached for the door, the lights flickered. The temperature in the room dropped, and the sound of whispering voices filled the air. At first, it was a faint rustling, but soon it became clearer, and the words were unmistakable. "Don't leave. Post, stay with us." The voices were coming from everywhere, beneath the bed, from the cracks in the walls, from the mirror. Sarah could see their breath fogging in the cold air. The whispers turned to soft, pleading cries, as if begging them to stay. But Sarah, now in full terror, bolted for the door. Mark was close behind, but as they turned the handle, it wouldn't open. The door was stuck, as if something invisible was holding it shut. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker. The air felt heavier, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The mirror in front of them began to ripple, the cracks spreading like spider webs. Sarah screamed. She could see something moving in the reflection. It wasn't them. A pale, gaunt figure emerged from the mirror, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. The figure's mouth opened, releasing a sound like a tortured scream. Mark tried to pull her away, but his hand slipped through the figure's form, as if it were made of smoke. In sheer panic, Sarah screamed again, yanking on the door with all her might. Finally, it gave way. They tumbled into the hallway, but as they turned to run, they saw something that made their blood freeze. The hallway was no longer empty. Figures stood at the far end, their faces obscured by shadows, but their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Without a second thought, they ran down the hallway, through the lobby, and out into the cold, stormy night. They didn't stop until they reached their car, and even then, they didn't look back. They left the Whispering Pines Motel behind, never speaking of the horrors they witnessed again. But years later, Sarah received a letter. It was postmarked from the same town. The envelope was blank, except for one phrase written in dark, spidery handwriting. "Welcome back. We've been waiting."
Story number 3.
It had been a long, grueling week for Jake, and the drive back home was taking longer than expected. The night had fallen, and his GPS had stopped working a while ago. He was on a back road with nothing but trees stretching out for miles and no sign of civilization in sight. He was starting to get desperate when he spotted an old, barely lit motel by the side of the road. The Hollow Inn. A flickering neon sign buzzed faintly above the entrance. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but Jake, tired and drained, didn't have many options. He pulled into the parking lot and parked under the dim light of the motel sign. It was almost completely silent. Even the wind seemed hesitant to make a sound. He stepped out of the car and made his way to the lobby, the old wooden floorboards creaking with every step. Inside, the air smelled stale, and the walls were lined with peeling wallpaper. The woman behind the counter was elderly, with a haggard face that looked as though it hadn't seen sunlight in years. She looked up at Jake, her pale blue eyes unblinking, and gave him a faint, unsettling smile. "Room 7 is all yours, dear," she said in a raspy voice, handing him a key. "Stay as long as you need." He thanked her, trying to brush off the weird energy in the air, and made his way to the room. As he passed the hallway, he noticed something strange. There were no other rooms visible. It was as if the hall stretched on forever, with nothing but doors to nowhere. But Jake, exhausted, didn't think much of it. When he entered room 7, it was small and musty, with an old bed, a single lamp, and a faded painting on the wall. The air was thick with dust, and the bed's mattress looked worn and sunken. He didn't care. He just needed to sleep. As Jake lay in the bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, he felt a strange sensation, like something was watching him. It was the kind of feeling you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried. He turned over, trying to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Suddenly, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, and they stopped right outside his door. The knob rattled once, then fell silent. He sat up, heart pounding, but when he looked through the peephole, no one was there. The hallway was empty. His pulse raced, but he dismissed it as his imagination. He pulled the covers over his head and tried to sleep. The night dragged on, and the sounds from the hallway grew louder. The footsteps returned, louder this time, and there were whispers, murmurs of voices, almost like a conversation, but the words were too muffled to make out. He clenched his fists, eyes wide, staring at the door as the whispers grew into a low chant. "Leave, leave, leave." The whispers seemed to come from all directions. Jake jumped out of bed, heart hammering in his chest. He reached for the door, but as his fingers brushed the handle, the room went cold. The air felt dense, like a weight pressing down on him. The whispers turned into screams, and the walls around him began to warp and stretch. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to twist in impossible ways. The door wouldn't open. Panic flooded his chest, and he turned, stumbling back toward the bed. But that's when he saw it. A shadow, tall and unnaturally thin, standing at the foot of his bed. It had no face, just darkness where its features should be. Its long, skeletal fingers twitched as it began to move toward him. Jake screamed, backing into the corner of the room. He could feel the air thickening around him, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. The shadow reached out, its hand now inches from his face, when suddenly the door burst open. The elderly woman stood in the doorway, her expression blank. She said nothing, but in that moment Jake knew he had to leave. He bolted for the door, but as he passed the woman, she whispered in his ear, "They never leave. They always stay." Jake ran through the hallway, not daring to look back. The footsteps followed him, faster now, echoing down the corridor. He didn't stop until he reached his car, and he didn't dare to look in the rearview mirror as he sped away from the Hollow Inn. He never stopped to ask himself if what he'd seen was real, or if it had all been some terrible nightmare. But he never spoke of the place again, and never drove down that road again, for he knew deep down that some places weren't meant to be found, and some things weren't to be seen. The Hollow Inn was one of those things, and it was waiting for anyone who dared to step into its twisted embrace.
Story number 4.
Lena had always loved the idea of getting away from it all, so when she came across a small, isolated cabin for rent in the mountains, she didn't hesitate. The listing promised peace, quiet, and a perfect escape from the chaos of city life. It seemed like the ideal place to relax for the weekend. She arrived just as the sun began to dip behind the mountain peaks. The cabin was quaint, small, with a wraparound porch and a charming stone fireplace inside. The air was crisp, and the woods surrounding the cabin were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Lena unpacked her things, then took a walk around the property. The place was more remote than she had imagined. There were no neighbors for miles, and the closest town was at least an hour's drive away. It felt like the perfect sanctuary, untouched by the outside world. But as the evening began to fall and darkness started to take over, a strange feeling crept over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. But then, as she sat by the fire later that night, she heard it, a faint scratching sound from outside the cabin. It was soft, like nails scraping against wood. She stood up, uneasy, and went to the window, peering out into the darkened woods. Nothing. She went back to the fire, trying to push the feeling away, but the scratching continued, growing more persistent, more frantic. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, her breath visible in the chilly air. She scanned the surroundings but saw nothing, just trees stretching into the darkness. The noise stopped, but then she heard something else. A voice, faint but clear, calling her name. Lena. Her blood ran cold. She turned quickly, searching the trees again. Hello? She called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. Her pulse raced, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. The voice, she could swear it sounded like her own, but it wasn't her. Lena, come closer. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Lena stepped back toward the door, but before she could retreat inside, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The scratching started again, but now it was all around her, on the walls, the windows, even the floorboards. The sound grew louder, more erratic. A figure appeared at the edge of the woods, its shape almost human but twisted, its features obscured by shadows. It didn't move like a person, but more like it was sliding through the dark. The figure came closer, step by unnerving step, its outline becoming clearer. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, spindly arms hanging down to the ground. Its face was a blur, but Lena could make out two glowing eyes staring directly at her. Lena, come to me. Frozen, her feet rooted to the spot, Lena could only stare as the figure moved closer. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. The trees seemed to bend toward her, as if trying to reach out, their branches swaying in unnatural patterns. The thing stopped just at the edge of the porch, its glowing eyes fixed on hers. It was too close now. Lena felt a coldness seep into her bones. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, out of the corner of her eye, something moved in the darkness. Another figure, even more distorted, crawling along the ground, its limbs twisted in impossible angles. It skittered toward the porch, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the figure's mouth stretched wider, and from within, it spoke in a voice that sounded like a dozen others all speaking at once. You shouldn't have come here. The words echoed in her head, and she staggered backward, nearly tripping over the steps. She stumbled inside the cabin and slammed the door shut behind her. But the sounds didn't stop. The scratching intensified, now coming from every corner of the cabin. The figures outside began to circle the building, their glowing eyes peering through the windows. Lena backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't understand what they were or what they wanted. But one thing was certain, they weren't human. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in on her. She could hear the whispers now, faint and distant, but growing louder. They were saying her name over and over again, each whisper carrying more urgency. Come closer. A knock echoed from the door, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Lena's body froze in terror. She backed into a corner, clutching a chair for support. The door rattled as something, or someone on the other side tried to force its way in. Then the door creaked open by itself. Lena screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the hollow darkness. She turned to run, but as she did, the air seemed to shift. The room stretched out, warping like a funhouse mirror. The walls twisted and expanded, and the shadows grew taller. The whispering was no longer distant. It was right behind her in her ear, inside her mind. In that moment, Lena realized the truth. She hadn't rented a cabin. She had walked into something far older, far darker. The place she had found was not a sanctuary. It was a trap, a place where lost souls were drawn, where things beyond understanding waited for their next victim. And as the whispers grew louder, Lena knew she would never escape. Not alive, not as herself. She was part of it now. The cabin had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many before, and it was waiting for the next one to arrive.
Story number 5.
It was late when Adam arrived at the small, rural gas station. His car had broken down on a quiet stretch of highway, and there was no other sign of life for miles. The gas station was a dim, isolated place, with flickering lights and the smell of old grease in the air. Adam had tried calling roadside assistance, but his phone had no signal, so he reluctantly stepped out of the car and into the station. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the cracked linoleum floor. The counter was empty, but there was a bell, so Adam rang it. After a few moments, an older man appeared from the back, wiping his hands on a rag. He had an unkempt beard and wore a stained apron, but there was something about his smile that didn't seem quite right. "You need help with something?" the man asked, his voice too calm for the situation. "My car broke down a few miles back. Can I use your phone to call for a tow?" Adam said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the unease building in his stomach. The man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Sure, I got a phone, but you're not going anywhere tonight. Not in this weather." Adam frowned. The night had turned cold, and the wind was picking up, but there wasn't any storm in the forecast. Still, he didn't feel like arguing, especially since he had no other option. The man led him to the back room, where an old landline phone sat on a dusty countertop. Adam dialed the number for roadside assistance, but after several rings, the line went dead. "Looks like the phone's out too," the man said, his smile widening slightly. "You're stuck here for the night." Adam sighed, trying to suppress his rising panic. The man's smile had never wavered, and there was something in his eyes, something cold, calculating, that made Adam's skin crawl. "Do you have any place nearby where I could stay? A motel or something?" Adam asked, trying to keep the conversation normal. The man's expression didn't change. "There's no motel around here, just this gas station and the road. It's better to stay here." "Okay, thanks," Adam said quickly, backing out of the room. Something about the man's tone made him feel trapped, like he wasn't welcome to leave. As Adam stepped back into the main part of the station, he noticed a door leading down to what appeared to be a basement. He hadn't seen it before, but now that he had, it seemed to draw him in. The man didn't seem to notice, too busy wiping down the counter as if he didn't care about his guest. But curiosity gnawed at Adam. He was stuck here for the night, after all. Maybe the basement had a place to sleep, some old furniture, or a cot. He approached the door slowly, but just before he could touch the handle, the man's voice cut through the silence. "Don't go down there," he said, his tone no longer casual, but almost pleading. Adam stopped in his tracks. "Why not?" The man's eyes grew wide, and he lowered his voice. "Just don't. It's not safe." Adam took a step back, his heart racing. "I need to get out of here," he muttered, turning toward the exit. The man grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You don't want to leave. Trust me. It's not safe out there." Suddenly, everything clicked. The man had been watching him too closely, and there was a sense of desperation in his voice now, as if he were trying to keep Adam from realizing something. "Listen," Adam said, trying to jerk his arm free. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm leaving." But as he turned, a chill ran down his spine. He had seen something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the front of the gas station, just beyond the door. It had no face, no features, just darkness, and it was staring directly at him. Adam's breath caught in his throat as the figure moved slowly toward him. The man still gripping Adam's arm didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the figure standing just outside. It was closer now, its shape almost solidifying in the dim light. The air grew colder, the shadows inside the gas station deepening. "Who is that?" Adam asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's expression shifted. His grin faltered, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered under his breath. The figure outside stepped into the doorway, its body now fully visible. It was towering, too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its face was a void. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface. Before Adam could move, the man let go of his arm and backed away from the figure, muttering something that sounded like an apology. "It's not my fault. You shouldn't have come. No one should come." The figure stepped closer, filling the doorway with its grotesque presence. Adam froze, his body shaking uncontrollably. It was as if the air had thickened, the very walls closing in around him. Suddenly, the basement door creaked open behind him, and a voice, whispering, but undeniably familiar, called out, "Adam, come to me." In that moment, everything became clear. The gas station wasn't just a place of isolation. It was a trap, a place where lost travelers were drawn, where they would never leave. The figure outside had been waiting for him, and the man had only been a part of its twisted game. Adam turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut with a deafening thud. His only option now was to face whatever lay outside, whatever had been calling his name. But he knew one thing for sure: he would never leave this place. The gas station had claimed him, and now there would be no escaping the darkness that lingered inside its wall.
Story number 6.
The night was unusually quiet when Sarah found herself driving down a long, winding road in the middle of nowhere. The GPS had died hours ago, and her phone was on its last leg of battery. It was the kind of night that made her wonder if she had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The moon was barely visible behind thick clouds, and the only light came from the weak beam of her headlights. She had been on the road for far too long, and exhaustion was setting in. She hadn't passed a town in hours, and the only thing keeping her company was the occasional croak of a distant frog or the rustling of the trees in the wind. She thought she might be hallucinating when, in the distance, a sign appeared, barely visible in the gloom. "The Black Oak Inn, rooms available." Relieved, Sarah took the turn, hoping for a quick stop. The inn wasn't far off the road, about a quarter mile in fact, and as she pulled into the driveway, it felt oddly isolated, as though it had been abandoned for years. The place looked like something straight out of an old horror movie. A large, Victorian-style building with ivy creeping up its sides and broken shutters hanging from the windows. The porch sagged under the weight of time, and the lights flickered weakly from within. She hesitated for a moment, but the thought of getting some sleep overpowered her caution. Sarah parked her car and made her way inside. The lobby was dimly lit, and an old ceiling fan spun lazily above her head. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of stale wood and mildew lingered in her nose. A bell rang softly as she stepped in, but no one appeared. She was about to ring it again when she heard slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the back. A man appeared from a hallway. He was tall, with a gaunt face, pale skin, and deep-set eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. His clothes were old-fashioned, as if he'd stepped out of another time entirely. "Welcome," he said with an unsettling calmness. "I trust you've come for a room?" Sarah nodded, though she felt a sudden chill creep up her spine. The man didn't smile, but his lips twitched in a way that suggested he was trying to keep himself composed. "Room 8, he said. "It's the only one available. We don't get many guests these days." His tone was flat, and Sarah could tell he wasn't lying, but there was something strange in his voice that made her uncomfortable. She took the key without a word and made her way up the stairs. As she passed the hallway, she noticed how the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as though something was lurking just beyond her vision. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the floor creaked beneath her every step. Room 8 was at the end of the hall. When she opened the door, the air inside was colder than the rest of the house. The room was furnished sparsely, just an old bed with an ornate headboard, a dresser, and a large dust-covered mirror on the opposite wall. The window was shut tight and the curtains were drawn, leaving the room shrouded in a dull, gray light. Sarah set her things down and made her way to the window to see what the weather was like outside. But as she parted the curtains, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the yard just outside the inn, under the sickly glow of the porch light, she saw several dark figures standing in a row. They were tall, and they stood motionless, facing the inn. Their heads were tilted at odd angles, as if they were staring directly at her. She blinked and rubbed her eyes, but when she looked back, the figures were still there, unmoving, like statues in the yard. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She turned to find the man from the front desk standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm afraid we don't allow guests to wander outside after dark," he said softly, almost like a warning. "It's for your own safety." "Right? Sorry," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "I was just admiring the view." The man didn't respond, just gave a short nod and stepped back, but his eyes never left her. "Please get some rest. I'll be here if you need anything." The door clicked shut behind him, and Sarah, still unsettled, locked it and went to bed. She pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the creepy feeling that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She turned off the lamp and closed her eyes, hoping sleep would come quickly. But just as she was drifting off, she heard a faint sound, a scratching, almost like nails on wood. It started low, just at the edge of her hearing, but it grew louder with each passing second. It was coming from the wall, just beyond the bed. Then it stopped. She sat up, heart racing, but before she could react, she heard something else, a voice, soft and distant, calling her name. "Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was eerily familiar, but she couldn't place it. She listened closely, but it was so quiet, she almost wondered if it was just in her head. Then the voice came again, this time clearer, closer. "Sarah, come to us." Panicked, Sarah leaped out of bed and moved to the door. But before she could touch the knob, the scratching started again. Louder, frantic, as though something was trying to claw its way into the room. The room felt colder, and she shivered as she backed away from the door. The voice continued, now joined by others, whispers, moans, incoherent murmurs that surrounded her. She turned toward the window, but the figures in the yard were gone. Instead, she saw dozens of faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The door burst open, and the man from the front desk stepped inside, his eyes wide with panic. "You shouldn't have stayed here," he whispered urgently. "You need to leave now, before they come for you." Before she could respond, the walls of the room began to crack, and from the cracks emerged dark, writhing shapes, slithering their way toward her. The man backed away slowly, his face contorted in fear. "They never leave," he muttered. "Once they claim you, there's no escaping." Before she could even scream, the shape surged forward, enveloping her in a cold, suffocating darkness. The last thing Sarah heard was the man's voice, now distant and hollow. "You're one of them now."